The night my family humiliated me at dinner, I sat there smiling like I didn't hear a single word they said. But inside, something in me quietly shifted in a way I didn't fully understand yet. We were at my parents' house, same dining table I grew up at, same seats, same faces, but somehow I felt like I didn't belong in any of it anymore. My father raised his glass and said, "At least one of our kids actually made something of themselves." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone laughed, even my sister, even my mother, who didn't even look at me. And I remember just sitting there, fork halfway to my plate, realizing something that hit harder than the insult itself. I wasn't being talked to, I was being erased in real time. What they didn't know was that I had already started seeing things differently before I even walked into that house. And by the time I left that table that night, I wasn't the same person anymore. Not even close. What my family didn't realize was that the version of me they were laughing at wasn't the version of me anymore. There were things I had seen that day, earlier, before dinner, that I still hadn't fully processed. Things connected to my father's business that didn't make sense when I first saw them, but started forming a pattern I couldn't ignore. And the strange part? That dinner didn't feel random. It felt staged. Like every person at that table already knew something I didn't. So the question that stayed with me after I left was simple. Was that humiliation spontaneous? Or was I being positioned for something I hadn't discovered yet? And why did I suddenly receive a message that night from someone I didn't recognize, telling me to check my father's filings? Before I go further, if you've ever experienced that kind of quiet disrespect from people who are supposed to care about you, subscribe to MARRIANNE Tales. It's totally free and motivates us to keep creating powerful stories for you. And tell me, where are you watching this from? What country are you in? And what time is it for you right now? It genuinely means a lot. All right, now let me take you back to that night. I grew up in a house that always looked normal from the outside. Clean lawn, family photos in the hallway, holiday decorations that came out on schedule like clockwork. But inside that structure, there was always this unspoken ranking system. My brother Daniel was the safe pride. My sister Kayla was the attention pride. And I was the one they didn't really know what to do with. Not hated, not rejected outright, just overlooked in a way that slowly teaches you not to expect too much space in conversations. I learned early how to read rooms instead of people. At family dinners, I could tell within minutes who was going to be praised that night. It was never random. It followed patterns. Daniel would talk about numbers, money, growth. My father would lean in. Kayla would mention social things, trends, visibility. My mother would smile differently. When I spoke, the energy shifted in a way I couldn't always explain at the time. Not hostility, just reduction. Like the room quietly shrinking around me, so I got used to being efficient. Short answers, polite reactions, no need to compete for attention I wasn't going to win anyway. After college, I stayed in the city. I took a job in operations at a logistics company, behind-the-scenes work, problem solving, system fixing. It suited me in a strange way because I was already used to working in the background. The kind of work where if you do it right, nobody notices. But if you mess up, everyone suddenly remembers your name. At first, I thought my family would eventually start asking better questions, like how my job actually worked, or what I was responsible for, but they never really did. Instead, the conversations stayed on the surface. "Are you still at that company? That sounds stable." Stable always came with this tone. Like stability was something you settled for when you didn't quite make it to something better. Still, I kept showing up. Every Sunday dinner, every birthday, every holiday. Because I kept telling myself something simple: family is family, even when it feels like you're slowly becoming optional in it. The first real shift didn't look like a conflict. It looked like timing. My mom called me personally about the dinner. That alone was unusual. She usually texted or left it in the family group chat. But this time, her voice was different, softer, measured, like she was trying to make sure I actually agreed before I could think too much about it. "It's important that you come," she said. I remember pausing. "Important how?" A slight hesitation. Then just everyone will be there. That wasn't an answer. That was avoidance. Still, I said yes, because I always said yes. That night, before I left my apartment, I stood in front of the mirror a little longer than usual. Not because I was nervous, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I hadn't been fully told about. Even my outfit choice felt symbolic in hindsight. Simple, neutral, non-threatening, like I was trying not to take up too much space before I even arrived. When I got to my parents' house, everything looked exactly the same. Same porch light, same faint smell of cooking, same sound of voices already inside laughing without me, but something felt slightly off. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, observational way. Like when you enter a room and realize the conversation paused for half a second too long. My brother opened the door before I even knocked properly. "Hey," he said. Then, almost immediately, "Glad you made it." Not warm, not cold, just measured, like he was checking a box. Inside, I noticed something immediately. There was an extra person at the table, a man I didn't recognize, mid-40s maybe, not family, not introduced properly either. Just sitting like he belonged there, which was strange. Because at my parents' house, nobody just belongs without explanation. My mother hugged me quickly, too quickly, like she was trying to move past the moment instead of be in it. My father didn't hug me at all. He just looked at me for a second longer than usual and said, "You're here. Not your home. Not good to see you." Just acknowledgement of presence. That was the first moment I felt it. This wasn't a normal dinner. This was structured. And the strangest part? My father kept checking the time, like he was waiting for something to start, or waiting for someone to arrive. And every time I tried to read the room normally, I noticed something else. The man I didn't know wasn't eating like a guest. He was observing like an evaluator. And my brother, who usually ignored me, kept glancing at me like he already knew how the night was going to end. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just late to dinner. I might have been late to information everyone else already had. Dinner started like nothing was wrong. That's what made it worse. My mom brought out food like she always did: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, something warm and familiar that was supposed to feel comforting. But nobody was really eating, not properly. People were moving food around their plates more than they were actually taking bites. Even the silence didn't feel natural. It felt maintained, like everyone was waiting for a cue. The man I didn't know, still seated halfway across from me, finally introduced himself properly, but even that felt delayed. "Call me Mark," he said, nodding slightly. No explanation of why he was there. No context. Just a name dropped into a room that didn't ask for it. I gave a polite smile and said, "Nice to meet you." My father immediately followed with, "Mark works in compliance." That word landed differently than the rest of the conversation. Compliance, not family, not friend, not guest. Compliance. I remember noticing how my mother didn't react to that at all, like she already knew. Like I was the only one hearing the explanation for the first time. My brother Daniel leaned back in his chair first. He always did that when he wanted to take space in a conversation. "So," he said casually, looking at me, "how's work still going?" Same thing. The way he said same thing made it sound smaller than it was. I nodded. "Yeah, operations, still solving problems." He smirked a little. "Right, keeping things stable." That word again. Stable. My mother gave a small laugh, like she was trying to soften the moment. But it didn't land as humor. It landed as agreement. Then my father spoke, and everything tightened. "At least one of my kids actually built something noticeable," he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at Daniel. Like I wasn't part of the comparison, just the contrast. And then this is what I remember most clearly, he added, "Some people are just better suited for quieter roles." That wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room reacted for him. Daniel laughed. Kayla smiled without looking at me. My mother didn't correct it. Nobody did. That was the humiliation, not the sentence itself. The agreement around it. I smiled anyway, not because it didn't hurt, but because I didn't know what else I was supposed to do with my face in that moment. While they kept talking, something in me started separating. Not emotionally dramatic, just observational. Like I was watching myself sit at the table from a slight distance. I started noticing details I normally would have ignored. The way my father kept glancing at Mark. The way Mark wasn't reacting to the jokes. The way my brother kept checking my expression after every comment, like they weren't just talking to me, they were measuring me. My mother stood up at one point and refilled glasses without being asked. Too efficiently, too timed, and I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like dinner anymore, it feels like a setup, but I still didn't know for what. Then it happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, then again. I didn't check it immediately because my father was speaking again. But then he said something that made me look up. "We've had some interesting developments at work," he said casually, almost conversational. Mark nodded slightly at that, and that's when I checked my phone. Unknown number, one message. "Don't trust what they tell you tonight. Check your father's filings from last week." I stared at it, read it again. And for the first time that night, I wasn't confused about the dinner. I was confused about how someone outside this room knew enough to warn me about it. When I looked up again, the conversation had shifted. Subtly, but completely. Now they were talking around me instead of to me. My name wasn't being said anymore, just references, indirect comments. "She's good at systems. She's always been reliable." Reliable. Another word that sounds positive until you realize it means replaceable. Mark finally spoke directly to me again. "How long have you been in your role?" 4 years, I said. He nodded. Then said, "And you've had access to financial routing approvals in that time." That question didn't belong in a family dinner. It belonged in an audit. I felt my father's attention sharpen instantly. My brother stopped moving. Even my mother went still. And that's when I realized this wasn't a casual question. It was confirmation of something already in motion. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at Mark and said calmly, "Why are you asking me that here?" Silence. Not awkward, controlled. My father jumped in quickly. "Just conversation," he said too fast, but it wasn't. And I think everyone knew that now. Because for the first time, the room wasn't leading me. It was reacting to me reacting. And that changed the balance, just slightly, but enough. Mark closed his folder slowly, like he had already seen enough. And before anyone could steer the conversation back to normal, he said something that didn't feel like it was meant for the whole table. It felt directed at me, specifically. "We'll be following up soon." Then he stood up, and my father didn't stop him. That was the moment I realized, whatever this dinner was supposed to be, it wasn't finished yet. It was just the beginning of something they had already decided I was part of. Mark leaving didn't end the dinner. It changed it. The second he stood up and said, "We'll be following up soon," the room didn't relax like a normal family dinner would. It tightened. Like everyone had been holding a breath they were finally allowed to release, but didn't. My father gave a short nod. Too controlled. Too rehearsed. "Of course," he said. My mother immediately started clearing plates that didn't need to be cleared yet. Daniel suddenly became interested in his phone. Kayla stood up halfway and then sat back down like she forgot what she was doing. And me, I just stayed seated, because something about standing up felt like participating in something I still didn't understand. Mark left quietly. No handshake with my father, no small talk, just gone. And that absence felt heavier than his presence. That's when my father finally looked at me properly, not casually, not dismissively, properly, like he was recalculating something. Then he said, "You should head home soon, it's getting late." Not a suggestion, a release, like the part I was needed for was over. It was just the beginning of something they had already decided I was part of. I didn't leave immediately. I stood outside instead. Cold air, quiet street. That weird silence after tension leaves a room but hasn't left your body yet. My car was right there, but I didn't get in. Because my phone was already in my hand. And I was already opening things I normally wouldn't open at a family dinner. Emails, work notifications, system logs. At first, nothing unusual. Then I saw it. A flagged internal review request, sent 3 days ago. Submitted under my department access chain. My name wasn't on it directly, but my credentials were. That meant anything processed under that approval path could legally point back to me. I stared at it longer than I should have. Because the structure didn't make sense, I don't approve filings like this. At least, I'm not supposed to. So I scrolled deeper. And that's when I saw something that made the dinner upstairs feel completely different in hindsight. The request originated from a vendor tied to my father's company, and it had been escalated internally by someone above my pay grade, meaning someone had inserted it into my workflow deliberately, quietly, without my awareness, and I had been positioned as the technical link in it, not the origin, not the decision maker, the connection point. That's when my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number, another message. You were placed in that chain on purpose. I looked up instinctively at the house, lights still on, shadows moving inside, normal life continuing like nothing had shifted. But for me, everything had. I started replaying the dinner in my head, not emotionally, structurally, like a system. My father inviting me, the unknown man sitting there, the timing of the conversation shifts, the exact moment Mark asked about approvals, the way my brother watched my reactions, the way nobody reacted to his stable comment like it was new. They had heard it before, or expected it, which meant this wasn't the first time I was being assessed. It was just the first time I noticed. I didn't feel angry yet. That came later. Right now, it was something colder. Clarity. The kind that doesn't explode, it reorganizes everything you thought was normal. I remember thinking, how long has my role been bigger than my job description without anyone telling me? And worse, how many times had I already been used in systems I didn't understand? I closed my phone, opened it again, closed it again. Because once you see something like that, you can't unsee the structure behind it. Even family starts to look procedural. I didn't go back inside. That was the first real decision I made that night without asking for permission from the situation. Instead, I got in my car, sat there for a moment, engine off, hands on the wheel, and I said out loud, not to anyone, just to myself, I need to understand what this actually is. Not what they told me it was. Not what it looked like from inside the dinner, but what it actually was underneath it. Then I turned the key and drove, not home, not anywhere familiar, just away from the structure that had been holding me in place longer than I realized. Halfway through the drive, my phone lit up again. This time it wasn't a message. It was a contact request from someone saved under a name I hadn't seen in years, someone connected to my father's business network, someone I thought had nothing to do with me anymore. And when I saw that name, I realized the dinner wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the moment everything started connecting backward. I almost didn't accept the contact request. My thumb hovered over it for a few seconds longer than I'd like to admit, because the name on the screen wasn't just familiar, it was tied to a part of my life I thought had ended cleanly. Evan Rourke, my father's former business consultant, and someone who, years ago, stopped showing up around the same time my father started expanding into new partnerships he never talked about at family dinners. I accepted. Immediately, a message came through. I didn't expect you to be involved in this chain. I stared at that sentence. Not this situation. Not your job. This chain. That word again. Chain. Everything tonight was starting to sound like structure instead of coincidence. I typed back, "What chain?" It took him less than 10 seconds to respond. "The approval routing tied to your credentials. It's not random. It's placement." I felt my grip tighten around the steering wheel. Placement. Like I wasn't a person in a job. Like I was a position inside a system. While I waited for him to reply again, my mind kept pulling me backward. Not to the dinner, before it. Earlier that same day. I remembered sitting at my desk at work when an internal task request popped up. It looked normal, routine. But I also remembered hesitating before clicking approve. Not because it was unusual, but because something about the formatting felt slightly off, like it had been forwarded instead of generated. At the time, I ignored it, because everything in my job is small decisions stacked on small decisions. But now, that single click didn't feel small anymore. It felt like a door I didn't realize I was opening. My phone buzzed again. Evan had responded. "Your father's company is under structured review, not public yet. Internal containment phase." I read it twice. Internal containment. That didn't sound like a misunderstanding. That sounded like damage control. Then another message came immediately after. "They didn't place you in the system by accident. They placed you because you wouldn't question it fast enough." That one hit differently. Not insulting. Not emotional. just calculated observation, like he had already studied how I think. I finally parked the car somewhere I didn't recognize, turned the engine off, and just sat there, because the shape of everything was changing too fast to process in motion. My family dinner wasn't just humiliation. It was evaluation. My job wasn't just work, it was access. And my silence over the years wasn't neutral anymore, it was usable. That's the part that made my chest feel tight, not betrayal, recognition, of how predictable I had been to people who were never explaining the full picture. I finally parked the car somewhere I didn't recognize, turned the engine off, and just sat there, because the shape of everything was changing too fast to process in motion. My family dinner wasn't just humiliation, it was evaluation. My job wasn't just work, it was access. And my silence over the years wasn't neutral anymore, it was usable. That's the part that made my chest feel tight, not betrayal, recognition, of how predictable I had been to people who were never explaining the full picture. Evan sent one more message, this time longer. Your father's financial routing structure uses internal employees as validation points. You were added to one of those layers 6 months ago. That approval path you saw, it's part of it. 6 months. I tried to think back. Nothing obvious stood out. But that's what made it worse. Because the most dangerous part wasn't missing something dramatic. It was not noticing anything at all. And then I remembered something small. A conversation at work. A manager casually asking me to double-check a few back-end approvals going forward. At the time, it felt like trust. Now it felt like insertion. For the first time since the dinner, I didn't feel like I was trying to understand what was happening. I felt like I was finally starting to map it. Slowly, carefully, without emotion driving the interpretation. Just facts connecting to facts. I opened my laptop, not to react, to verify, and I started pulling access logs. Not everything made sense yet, but enough did. Enough to confirm one uncomfortable truth. I wasn't being accused of something. I was being traced through something. Another notification came through while I was scrolling. Internal system alert. Unusual access review flagged. My credentials, active monitoring status, and a timestamp. From earlier that evening, exactly during dinner. Which meant someone at that table wasn't just talking about work. They were watching it live. And then my phone lit up one more time. Unknown number again. One line only. Now you understand why Mark was there. And that was the moment I realized the dinner wasn't the event. It was the checkpoint. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. At some point, I must have dozed off in the driver's seat because I remember waking up to light shifting through the windshield and my neck stiff from the angle I'd been sitting in. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then everything came back. Dinner, Mark, the approval chain, the messages, Evan. And that feeling that I had stepped into something that was already moving long before I arrived. My phone was still in my hand. Battery low, 3 missed calls, all from my mother. No voicemail, just calls. That alone told me enough. When my phone finally buzzed again, it wasn't her. It was Daniel. Where are you? Dad's asking. No, are you okay? No acknowledgement of last night, just logistics. Like I was late for something normal. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened Evan's last message again. Now you understand why Mark was there. I kept staring at that line longer than I should have, because it implied something I didn't want to fully accept yet. That Mark wasn't introduced to me. He was introduced through me. I finally started the car. Before I could even pull out, my phone rang again. This time I answered. My mother's voice came through immediately. Not warm, not soft, controlled. Where were you last night? I kept my voice steady. I left after dinner. A pause, long enough that I could hear background noise on her end. Then, you embarrassed your father. That sentence didn't sound emotional. It sounded rehearsed. Like it had been decided already that I was the problem in the story. I said, I didn't do anything. Another pause. Then she lowered her voice slightly. You need to come home, now. Not a request, a reset. Like the situation needed correcting. I didn't answer immediately. Because something about the tone confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't confused about what happened last night. They were reacting to what I might have seen. I don't know why I went back. Or maybe I do. It wasn't obligation. It was information pressure. That feeling that if you don't return to the source, you'll keep guessing wrong. So I drove back to my parents' house. Same street, same driveway, same porch light. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like re-entering a controlled environment. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She didn't hug me. She stepped aside immediately. "Your father wants to talk," she said. That's all. No greeting, no warmth, just instruction. My father was already sitting. Daniel was there too, Kayla wasn't. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was the absence of food, drinks, or anything casual. This wasn't a family setting. This was a meeting. My father looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You should have told us you were involved in compliance review discussions." I stayed quiet, because I wasn't involved in anything intentionally. That's what I almost said. But I didn't, because Evan's message was still sitting in my head. "They didn't place you there by accident." My father leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand what kind of exposure you created last night?" Exposure. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. Exposure. That word told me everything about how they were framing this. I said calmly, "I think I'm still trying to understand what I was part of." Daniel laughed under his breath. Not loud, just enough. "You're not part of anything," he said, but my father didn't correct him. That was new. That silence meant more than the words. My father stood up and walked toward the window. He always did that when he wanted control of a conversation. Without looking at me, he said, "Mark is reviewing internal processes tied to our vendors." Pause. "Then, and unfortunately, your department has been flagged as a connection point." Connection point. Not mistake. Not error. Point. I finally asked, "Why am I involved in that?" My father turned slightly. Not fully, just enough. "Because your credentials were used." That's when something inside me went still, because he didn't say you used your credentials. He said they were used. That difference mattered. A lot. I felt it then. Not anger yet. Not fear, something cleaner. Recognition. That I had been inside a structure where my participation was assumed, not explained. And worse, that my silence had made me more useful than my voice ever could. I said quietly, "So last night wasn't a dinner." My father didn't answer immediately, which was an answer. Then he said, "It was a conversation you weren't supposed to interrupt." That landed differently, because it confirmed something I was only starting to understand. I wasn't being excluded. I was being positioned. For the first time in that room, I didn't try to explain myself. I didn't argue. I didn't justify. I just asked one question. "Who placed my credentials in that chain?" Silence again, longer this time. My mother looked at my father. Daniel shifted in his seat, and my father didn't answer immediately. He just said, "That's not the point." But it was, and everyone in the room knew it. That was the moment the balance started to change. Not dramatically, not visibly, but irreversibly. Because once you stop defending yourself, people have to start revealing what they were assuming you wouldn't ask. My father finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Evan Rourke has been contacting you, hasn't he?" That name hit the room differently. Even Daniel stopped moving, because whatever story they were telling themselves about control just slipped slightly. And I realized something in that moment. The dinner wasn't the beginning. The system wasn't the beginning. Even Mark wasn't the beginning. Evan was. And whatever he knew was about to decide what happened next. My father saying Evan's name changed the room instantly. It wasn't loud. Nobody reacted dramatically. But the air shifted, like everyone had just acknowledged something they didn't want spoken out loud. My father turned slightly toward me. "So he did contact you?" Not a question. A confirmation. I said nothing, because I didn't want to give him information I didn't fully understand yet. Daniel finally spoke, quieter than before. "Why would Evan contact her?" That question wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion. My father didn't answer him. He looked at me instead. Like the conversation had narrowed down to a single point. Then he said, "Because he's trying to destabilize the review." That word again. Review. Everything kept circling back to systems I wasn't supposed to see directly. My phone buzzed in my pocket at that exact moment. I didn't need to check to know it was him, but I did anyway. "Evan, don't let them frame you as the cause. You're a connector, not the source." I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Connector, not origin, not problem, connector. That was the second time someone used that word to describe me, and it was starting to sound like a category instead of a coincidence. I stepped outside before anyone could stop me. My father didn't try. That alone told me everything about how much control they thought they still had. I answered the call. Evan's voice was calm, not rushed, not emotional, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. "You're inside a routing loop," he said immediately. I leaned against the side of the house. "A what?" "A controlled approval chain. Your credentials are one of several validation nodes." I stayed quiet, because part of me understood what he meant, even if I didn't like it. He continued, "Your father's company doesn't move sensitive approvals directly. It routes them through internal employee access points to legitimize processing history." That sounded technical, but the meaning underneath it was simple. People weren't just approving things, they were being used as proof that approvals were legitimate. I said slowly, "And I'm one of those points." A pause. "Yes." No hesitation. That was the part that landed hardest. Not accusation. Clarity. Evan lowered his voice slightly. "This isn't new, it's just expanded." He continued, "Your father's network has multiple companies feeding into shared vendor pipelines. To external auditors, it looks normal. Internal employees like you are used as distributed verification layers." I tried to process that, slowly, carefully. "So, I'm not approving anything." "You are," he said, "just not intentionally." That distinction made everything feel worse, because it meant my actions had weight I wasn't aware of, and someone else had built the system knowing I wouldn't question it fast enough to matter. I asked, "Why me?" Evan didn't hesitate. "Because you don't overreact." That line stayed silent between us for a second too long. Not insulting, just accurate, and that's what made it uncomfortable. While I was still on the call, I looked through the window. My father was standing exactly where I left him, watching, not pacing, not moving, just waiting, like he already knew I was learning something. Daniel was on his phone again, but his posture was different now, less relaxed, more alert. That's when I realized something subtle but important. They weren't reacting to what I knew. They were reacting to what I might confirm. There's a difference. A big one, Evan continued. And there's something else you need to understand. I didn't interrupt. Mark isn't there to investigate your father only. I straightened slightly. What does that mean? He's there to map dependency integrity across the chain. That sounded abstract, until he clarified. Basically, who reacts when certain nodes are triggered. That landed differently, because it wasn't about wrongdoing. It was about response behavior, patterns, predictability. I said quietly, "So last night wasn't about me being accused. It was about watching how you respond when exposed to pressure." A pause. Then Evan added, "And you responded exactly how they expected." That should have sounded like criticism, but it didn't. It sounded like confirmation. I looked down at the ground for a moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was recalibrating everything I thought I understood about my role in my own life. My family dinner wasn't random. My job wasn't isolated. Even my silence wasn't neutral anymore. It had been observed, recorded, used. I said quietly, "So what happens now?" Evan's answer was immediate. "Now they adjust." That was the part that felt most unsettling, because it implied I wasn't at the center of this. I was part of a moving system reacting around me. Something changed in me at that moment, not emotionally, structurally. I stopped seeing myself as the problem in the situation, and started seeing myself as a reference point inside a larger design. I said into the phone, "What do I need to do?" Evan paused, for the first time. Then he said, "Stop behaving like a passive node." I frowned slightly. He clarified, "They're still measuring whether you'll default back to silence." That's when I looked back through the window again. My father hadn't moved, still watching, still waiting, like he was still expecting the version of me that would comply without questioning. Evan added one last thing before ending the call. "Tomorrow, they'll try to reset the narrative." I asked, "How?" And he said, "They'll invite you back into the room and try to make you forget you ever left it mentally." Then he hung up. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand, because now I understood something clearly. Last night wasn't the peak. It was the test. And whatever came next was going to decide whether I stayed inside their version of the story or finally stepped out of it completely. I didn't go back inside right away. I stayed outside longer than I needed to because I already understood what Evan meant by reset the narrative. It wasn't going to be a confrontation. It was going to be something quieter, smoother, more familiar. The kind of manipulation that doesn't feel like pressure until you realize you're already moving back into position. When I finally walked in, the atmosphere had changed. Not obviously, not dramatically, but enough. My mother looked up first, smiled too quickly. "Are you okay?" she asked, like nothing had happened. That question hit strangely, because it wasn't about concern, it was about restoration. My father was sitting in the same chair again, calm, composed. Like the conversation outside had never happened. Daniel even tried a small half-smile. "Everything good?" That was the first sign. They were restarting the room. My father leaned back slightly. "We were a bit intense earlier," he said casually, not an apology, a reframing. Then he added, "You know how work stress can bleed into personal conversations." That sentence was doing something specific. It was separating last night from meaning, reducing it into emotion instead of structure. My mother nodded quickly. "Yes, it's been a stressful week for everyone." Everyone. That word again. Like I was being absorbed back into a group explanation that erased specifics. Daniel chimed in. "Mark meetings always feel like that. Overanalysis." Mark meetings. Plural. Like I had misinterpreted a pattern that was supposedly routine, but I remembered clearly. There was only one meeting I had seen him in, and it wasn't like this. My father gestured slightly toward the table. "Sit. Eat something." Simple sentence. But it wasn't about food. It was about resuming participation. I sat down slowly, not because I agreed, because I wanted to see how far the reset would go. My mother immediately refilled my glass. My father changed the subject. Daniel started talking about something unrelated, sports, work, anything neutral. They were rebuilding the room layer by layer, carefully, like nothing had ever cracked. And for a moment, I understood how easy it would be to slip back into it, because nothing was being forced. Everything was being normalized. This was the part Evan didn't fully explain, not the investigation, not the system, this moment. Because there's a specific kind of pressure that doesn't push you outward. It pulls you inward, back into roles that feel familiar. My mother looked at me warmly now. "My love, you've been stressed. Maybe work is getting to you more than you realize." That wasn't accusation. That was reinterpretation. My father added gently, "If something is confusing you, we can help clarify it." Clarify, as if my perception was the problem. And for a second, just a second, I felt that old instinct, to agree, to smooth things over, to return to being understandable instead of questioning. That's the dangerous part, not the conflict, the comfort of being reabsorbed. I set my glass down, not hard, not dramatic, just enough. The room paused slightly, not visibly, but perceptibly. Then I said, "I want to talk about last night." My mother blinked. My father didn't react immediately. Daniel stopped moving entirely. I continued, not as stress, not as misunderstanding, just what it was. Silence. My father finally leaned forward slightly. "Go ahead," he said carefully. That wasn't permission. That was evaluation. I looked at him directly. I was brought into a conversation I wasn't informed about. Pause. I was referenced in work-related compliance discussions without context. Another pause. And I was spoken about at this table like I wasn't part of my own role. No emotion, no escalation, just structure. My mother opened her mouth slightly but didn't speak. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. My father watched me for a long moment, then said, "You're misunderstanding the nature of those discussions." That sentence was familiar. It was the same pattern as before, reframing instead of addressing. So I asked, "Then explain it clearly." That changed something, because now I wasn't reacting. I was requesting structure, and they weren't prepared for that version of me. My father stood up slowly, walked a few steps, not toward me, away from the table, a deflection gesture. Then he said, "Some things are internal operational matters. You don't need to be involved in every layer of interpretation." Internal. Again. Layer. Again. He was trying to push me back into a limited scope. But I'd already seen enough of the system to know those words didn't reduce my involvement. They just hid it. So I said quietly, if I'm part of a system, I deserve to understand how I'm being used in it. That was the first time the room didn't have a ready response. My mother looked at my father, waiting. Daniel looked down, avoiding. My father didn't respond immediately. And that silence told me more than any explanation could have, because it wasn't confusion, it was recalculation. Then finally he said, "You're overthinking your role." But it didn't land the same way anymore, because I wasn't asking for reassurance. I was asking for architecture, and he couldn't provide it without revealing too much. My phone buzzed in my pocket, once, then again. I didn't need to check it to know who it was, but I did anyway. Evan. One line only. "Good, they're losing the ability to reset you." I looked up from the table, and for the first time since this began, I realized the dinner wasn't trying to humiliate me anymore. It was trying to contain me again, and it was starting to fail. Evan's message didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel awake, like I could finally see the difference between what was being said in that room and what was actually happening underneath it. When I looked up from my phone, my father was watching me. Not casually anymore. Not as a parent checking in, as someone trying to measure whether I was still inside their frame. My mother broke the silence first. "You're on your phone again," she said lightly, like it was normal. But it wasn't about the phone. It was about interruption. I set it down, slowly, and said, "I think we should finish what we started." That sentence changed the room, because it didn't fit their reset. My father exhaled through his nose like he was trying to stay calm. "There's nothing to finish," he said, but he said it too quickly. Daniel shifted again. My mother looked down at her plate. No one touched their food anymore. I leaned forward slightly. "There is," I said, "because last night wasn't normal. And today isn't either." Silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that starts exposing structure. My father finally responded, "You're mixing work stress with personal interpretation." That phrase again. Mixing, interpretation. Like reality was something flexible depending on who was speaking. I nodded slightly, then said, "Then explain Mark's presence." That was the first time I said his name out loud in that room. Mark, the compliance observer, the evaluator, the man who didn't behave like a guest at all. My mother tried to step in quickly. "Oh, Mark is just part of standard review processes. It's not." I interrupted gently. "Not what?" She stopped. That wasn't like me before. Before, I would have let her finish. My father leaned back again, but this time the movement wasn't relaxed. It was defensive. "He's auditing vendor pathways," he said. "That's all you need to know." That's all you need to know. That sentence was the real structure, not explanation, limitation. And that's when I realized something important. They weren't trying to lie to me. They were trying to limit how much truth I could hold at once. I looked at my father directly. "For how long?" He frowned slightly. I continued, "For how long have I been part of something I wasn't informed about?" My mother finally spoke again, sharper this time. "You're making it sound worse than it is." That was interesting, because she didn't deny it. She just adjusted severity. Daniel added quietly, "You don't understand corporate systems. It's complicated." Complicated. Another soft word used to close doors. I nodded slowly. Then said, "I think I understand enough." That made my father stand up again, this time faster. My father walked toward the table edge. "You're being influenced by outside interpretations," he said. But it didn't sound like control anymore. It sounded like pressure, like something slipping. I said calmly, "I'm being informed by someone who isn't trying to protect the narrative." That landed. Daniel looked at me sharply. My mother went still, and my father finally said the name again. "Evan." But this time it wasn't confirmation. It was warning. I nodded. "Yes." Silence again, but this silence was different, because now they knew I wasn't guessing anymore. My father lowered his voice slightly. "You should stop talking to him." That wasn't advice. That was containment. And for the first time, I realized something important. They weren't afraid of what I knew. They were afraid of what I was being shown. I asked quietly, "Why?" No answer. That was the answer. I stood up, slowly, not aggressively, just done sitting. The room reacted instantly, even though no one said anything, because standing up changed my position in the system. I said, I'm not asking for permission to understand my own situation anymore. My mother's voice softened again. Please don't make this difficult. That line, difficult, as if clarity was disruption. I looked at her and said, I'm not being difficult, I'm being accurate. And that's when I saw it. Not anger, not panic, recognition. They were losing alignment with me. My father picked up his phone, looked at it once, then said something I didn't expect. He's coming here. I frowned slightly. Mark, he nodded. And for the first time since this started, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain. My mother whispered, Why now? My father didn't answer her. He looked at me instead and said, Because now you've stopped behaving like we expected you to. That sentence changed everything, because it confirmed something Evan had implied earlier. This wasn't just observation anymore. It was active adjustment, and I was now part of the variable they could no longer control quietly. My phone buzzed again. Evan, one line, don't agree to anything he offers. I looked up as the car outside pulled into the driveway, headlights flashing across the window. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't about understanding the system anymore. It was about what happens when the system realizes you understand it back. The headlights stayed on longer than they should have. That was the first thing I noticed. Like whoever was in the car wasn't in a rush to come inside, or maybe they were waiting for something inside to settle first. My father didn't move. My mother stood near the kitchen entrance now, hands clasped together in a way that looked calm if you didn't know her. Daniel had stopped pretending to be relaxed entirely. And me, I just stayed standing, because sitting again would have meant returning to their version of the moment. The doorbell rang once. No hesitation, no second ring, just a single, clean signal. My father finally spoke without looking at anyone. Stay composed. Not advice, instruction. He walked to the door and opened it. Mark stepped inside like he had been there before, not unfamiliar, not uncomfortable, just aligned with the space. His eyes moved through the room once, then landed on me, and stayed there slightly longer than they did on anyone else. Evening, Mark said. No greeting warmth, no personal tone, just functional acknowledgement. My father gestured toward the living room. We were just discussing the situation. Mark nodded once, then corrected him immediately. It's not a situation yet. That sentence shifted everything again, because it implied stages. My mother tightened her grip on her hands. Daniel looked down. My father exhaled slowly through his nose, and I stayed still. Because I understood something now. Mark didn't enter rooms to explain things. He entered to confirm whether the structure still held. Then Mark finally spoke to me directly. Have you been in contact with Evan Rourke today? I didn't hesitate. Yes. That was enough. My father's jaw tightened slightly. My mother closed her eyes for half a second. Daniel muttered something under his breath, but didn't finish it. Mark nodded, like he was logging it internally. Then he said something I didn't expect. That explains the deviation. Deviation. Not mistake. Not confusion. Deviation from expectation. That word confirmed something Evan had hinted at earlier. I wasn't being judged emotionally. I was being tracked structurally. Mark walked a few steps into the room. Not toward my father. Not toward the center. Toward alignment. Like he was positioning himself in relation to something invisible. Then he said, Your role in the approval chain is not administrative. My stomach tightened slightly. He continued, It's structural validation. You sit at a junction point that confirms continuity of internal routing. My father cut in quickly. That's not how we. Mark raised a hand slightly. Not aggressive, but final. It is how it is defined externally. That sentence landed heavier than anything else. Externally, meaning there were internal definitions and external interpretations, and they didn't match. I said quietly, So I'm not approving things. Mark looked at me directly. No, Pause. You're confirming system legitimacy without being aware of it. That was the moment the room went completely still. Because that wasn't accusation. That was architecture. My mother finally spoke. Why is she being involved in this at all? Her voice was quieter now. Less controlled. Mark answered without looking at her. Because she was statistically optimal for non-disruptive validation behavior. That phrase didn't belong in a family room. But it belonged in a system. Daniel looked up sharply. That's insane. But even he didn't sound certain anymore. My father stepped forward slightly. You're overextending the interpretation of internal routing protocols. Mark turned his head slightly. Then explain why she wasn't informed. Silence. Not because there was no answer. Because there was no acceptable answer to give in this room. I finally spoke. Calm. Clear. If I remove myself from it, what happens? Mark looked at me. For the first time, his expression changed slightly. Not emotional. Just acknowledging complexity. That depends on whether your removal has already been accounted for in downstream dependencies. I nodded slowly. So even leaving wasn't simple. Nothing in this structure was simple. My father said quickly, "You're not removing yourself from anything." That was the first time he sounded less like authority and more like resistance. I looked at him and said, "I already started." Mark checked his phone once, then said, "There it is." My father frowned. "What?" Mark looked up. "The adjustment." My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't need to look to know what it was. But I did anyway. "Evan." One line. "They've officially logged your deviation." I exhaled slowly. Because now it wasn't hidden anymore. It was recorded. My mother whispered, "What does that mean?" Mark answered honestly. "It means the system now expects you to behave differently going forward." Pause. "And it will respond accordingly." That wasn't a threat. That was consequence. The room didn't explode. It didn't need to. That's what I remember most. Everything just tightened. Like the conversation had reached a point where silence became pressure instead of pause. My father was still looking at me, but it wasn't the same look anymore. It wasn't control. It was calculation turning into concern. Mark stood slightly off to the side now, no longer the center of attention, but still clearly holding the structure of the conversation in place. And Evan's message was still open on my phone. "They've officially logged your deviation." Logged, that word felt final, not emotional, procedural. My mother stepped forward slightly. "This is getting too complicated," she said softly, but her voice wasn't aimed at me anymore. It was aimed at restoring order. Daniel finally spoke, but his tone had changed. "You're taking this too seriously," he said, but it didn't sound confident anymore. It sounded like someone trying to return a system to a previous version. My father, however, didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. "You need to understand something," he said slowly. And for the first time that night, he didn't sound like he was speaking from authority. He sounded like he was trying to prevent something from escalating. That shift mattered. A lot. Mark took a step forward again, not toward me, toward the center of the room, like he was reasserting the framework of the conversation. "This isn't personal anymore," he said. My mother immediately reacted. "What do you mean it's not personal?" "It involves her." Mark didn't respond to her directly. Instead, he looked at me. "You are currently a validated node in an active compliance trace. Your awareness changes system behavior." That sentence landed differently now, because I understood what it meant. I wasn't just involved anymore. I was influencing how the system reacted. My father exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what we were trying to avoid." That was the first honest sentence he'd said all night. My mother turned to me again. "Sweetheart, just step away from all this. Let them handle it." That sounded caring, but it was the same structure in softer language. Step away. Stop interacting. Return to non-awareness. Daniel added quickly, "You don't need to be part of this, it's not your world." That sentence hit harder than the others, because it was familiar. That was the narrative they always used, not rejection, separation, not you belong elsewhere. But you don't belong here. I looked at all of them and realized something simple. They weren't trying to argue with me anymore. They were trying to remove me from the equation without removing me physically. I spoke calmly. "I'm not stepping away from something I'm already inside of." Silence. That was the first time the room didn't respond immediately, because I wasn't asking for permission anymore. I was describing position. Mark nodded slightly. Not approval, acknowledgement. My father stepped closer now. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "This system reacts to exposure." That word again, exposure. I replied, "I'm not exposing anything. I'm just seeing it." That distinction mattered, and I think everyone in the room felt it. My mother's voice broke slightly for the first time. "This is going to affect everything," she said. Not anger, fear. My father looked at her briefly, then back at me. "You don't understand the scale of what you're touching." But I did understand something. Maybe not scale, but structure. And structure was enough. Mark finally spoke again. "There is now a secondary validation risk introduced." My father turned sharply. "What does that mean?" Mark answered plainly. "It means she is no longer neutral." That was the turning point, not emotionally, systemically. Because neutrality was the entire foundation they had been relying on, and I had just lost it. My phone buzzed again. "Evan, one line. They can't place you back into passive status anymore." I looked up. My father was already watching me read it. And for the first time, he didn't ask what it said, because he already knew. Mark checked something on his device, then said, "We'll need to escalate review protocols." My mother whispered, "Escalate to what?" No one answered her. Because that answer didn't belong in this room. My father finally spoke again, quieter than before. "This is going to affect your job." I nodded slightly. "I know." That wasn't defiance. That was acceptance of consequence. Daniel looked at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. Maybe I didn't either. But something had already shifted past the point of reversal. Mark looked between us, then said, "At this stage, separation is no longer optional." My mother shook her head slightly. No, this is still family." But no one responded to that, because the system in the room had already moved beyond family as the primary structure. My father took a slow breath and said something that felt heavier than everything before it. "If you continue this path, there will be consequences you won't be able to undo." I looked at him, and for the first time in this entire situation, I didn't feel like I was inside their world anymore. I felt like I was standing outside of the role they built for me, and whatever came next was no longer about staying included. My father's warning hung in the air, but it didn't land the way it was supposed to anymore, because something had already shifted too far for fear to reset it. Mark checked his device once, then spoke like a decision had already been made somewhere else. "She's being temporarily isolated from active routing dependencies." My mother stepped forward quickly. "Is that even legal? She's our daughter." That word, daughter, sounded like it belonged to a different version of the situation. Mark didn't respond to that. He just said, "This is procedural containment." Procedural, not personal. That distinction kept coming back like a wall. Daniel finally looked at me, but not with anger anymore, more like confusion. "You're really doing this?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer him, because I wasn't doing anything anymore. I was just no longer fitting where they expected me to. My phone buzzed again. "Evan, they're going to try to isolate you professionally next. Don't accept informal contact." Then immediately another message. "If Mark offers clarification meetings, refuse." I looked up, and as if timed, Mark said, "We can schedule a clarification session to stabilize your understanding." My father added quickly, "That would be best." It was subtle, but coordinated, like they were trying to gently guide me back into compliance. I looked at Mark, then at my father, and said simply, "No." Just that, no explanation, no negotiation. The room went still, not shocked, but recalibrating again. Mark paused. That was new. Then he said, "That response will be recorded as non-cooperative." I nodded slightly. "Then record it." My mother looked like she wanted to interrupt, but didn't. Daniel stood up slightly, then sat back down, because nothing they said now was restoring control. My father's voice lowered. "You don't realize what you're triggering." I looked at him and said, "I think I do now." And that was the truth. Not fully, but enough. Mark checked his device again, then said, "We'll need to escalate externally." My father's expression tightened. Not anger, concern, because that wasn't part of the plan. My mother whispered, "Externally?" But no one explained, because explanations were no longer part of this room. Evan sent one last message. "You're out of passive containment. They'll shift strategy now." I took a slow breath. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was just observing the system react to me. My father stepped forward slightly. "This doesn't end here," he said quietly. I nodded. "I know," and I meant it. Because for them, this was escalation. But for me, this was the first time I wasn't inside their version of the story anymore. Mark closed his device. "My report will reflect non-alignment status." Then he left. No dramatic exit. Just done, and that silence afterward felt different. Not heavy, clear. I didn't leave the house in chaos. I left it in silence. That's what stayed with me most. Not shouting, not confrontation. Just the quiet moment when everyone realizes the story they were controlling isn't following the script anymore. And as I drove away that night, I understood something simple. You don't always escape a system by fighting it. Sometimes you just stop playing the role that keeps it stable. And once that happens, everything else has to adjust around you. I didn't leave the house in chaos. I left it in silence. That's what stayed with me most. Not shouting. Not confrontation. Just the quiet moment when everyone realizes the story they were controlling isn't following the script anymore. And as I drove away that night, I understood something simple. You don't always escape a system by fighting it. Sometimes you just stop playing the role that keeps it stable. And once that happens, everything else has to adjust around you. I didn't need to see what happened after I left anymore. Because for the first time, I wasn't part of their system to begin with. Thanks for listening to my story. If this story resonated with you, or reminded you of something you've been through or quietly felt before, then do subscribe to MARRIANNE Tales. It truly means a lot. This is the place where things slowly unfold, and truth eventually finds its way out.